the Irish perspectives on certain parts of Scottish archaeology, when you initially was getting very nationalistic and Juliet about Iona, I felt I put my hand and saying, look, it's an Irish monastery. But I remember this sort of attitude when I excavated there 20 years ago. I convinced Patrick Ashmore at the time that the proper place to publish the excavation at Iona was in the Ulster Journal of Archaeology and not in the Proceeding of the Antiquaries, which I don't think I'd get away with today, but it did at the time. New perspectives. I'm going to try and look very generally at what has occurred over the last 10 years in Ireland in early medieval archaeology, because we've had to rethink a lot about what we thought we knew already. And I have us down there with the Heritage Council and UCD. I've been working with a project with Aidan O'Sullivan, financed by the Heritage Council, who allowed us to hire some postdocs over the last few years. And we've been trying to get a lot of the material that's in the grey literature and put it online. So if you go into Google and EMAP and archaeology, we produce big volumes of a lot of the unpublished material that mightn't see the light of day for years or even decades. We've tried to summarise it and put it up there for people to have available. Here was our problem. There's a number of excavations that we had since the foundation of the state in the 1920s, and you can see that after 1991, especially after the year 2000, the amount of excavations that occurred in Ireland absolutely exploded. And there was nothing like a similar increase in Northern Ireland. And most of this was due to infrastructure, development in the building of roads, and also in the building of houses. Now I'm going to skip through different themes, but I'm going to start off with the easy ones, as it were, by looking at our attitudes to burials and how that has changed. Now, we just previously assumed that people were buried in Iron Age round bars with cremations until the beginning of the early Christian period, and then they quickly shifted over to Christian burials. But indeed, the literature told us this wasn't the case. Tyrconnell, and well, first of all, Adamnan describes Columba burying, I think, somebody in a mound of stones, pagan burial ground. And Tyrconnell, writing in the late 600s, talks about burial of two daughters. He said they made a round ditch in the manner of a ferta because this is what the pagan used to do as a burial. But only in recent times did we get actual evidence for this. This is a site at Kiltulla, County Mayo, actually one I dug myself. And you can see it got a very nice date right at the beginning of Christianity. And there behind it you have the ferta, or the barrow. And in front of it, unusually, you have an east-west burial, probably a Christian burial, and a stone erected over the body. But we begin to get much more evidence for this now, continuation of burial. And one of the places we got it at was at Knowth. Remember, Knowth, dug by George Ogan over the last 35 years. The first thing he found was a load of early Christian material. He had no interest in the early Christian material for a while, so we put it in a drawer, or a series of drawers. And it only got published last year, and it's actually a wonderful early medieval site. And you can see that at that site, going back to the Neolithic burial, and then in the Middle Iron Age, they started building these inhumation burials, about 20, 30 of them right around the edge of the tomb. But this actually continues into the early medieval period, and you have another set of burials going on to the 7th and 8th century, continuing burial in this pagan context, with some of them actually opting to be buried inside the Neolithic chambers. So here you get some such continuity. Now, the church actually, as we found through Betty O'Brien's recent work on the early literature, the church actually condoned the burial continuation in pagan monasteries, in pagan in graves. In the Collectio Canonum Hibernensis, which is early 8th century, which was partially written on Iona, you have the argument made that people had a right to be chosen to be buried in the pagan burial grounds. And they quote the quotation from Genesis, when Jacob is dying in Egypt, and he says, "Do not bury me in Egypt, but let me lie with my fathers. Carry me out of Egypt and bury me in their burying place." And the early church in Ireland felt this was a legitimate reason why people could continue being buried in pagan burial grounds. The same collection, however, does stipulate that clerics had to be buried in a church burial ground, because they state that just as a monk falls under the authority of the abbot, therefore in burial they should be with the the Christian grounds. And I suppose when we looked at these early excavations of early medieval sites like Church Island and Riask, we didn't really ask those questions about who was buried in these graveyards, and they can see that there are a relatively small number of burials. Now, in the case of Church Island, I don't think the bones were tested for the gender of the burials, and they didn't survive in the bad burial conditions at Riask. But in Loughin, recently introduced, where there were a set of burials, all of them turned out to be male, adult male burials. And also the same turned out at the recently published site at High Island, where you had a small burial area just at the end of the church that you can see there. And there was a series of about 7 or 8 burials, quite late, 10th, 11th century date, and all, again, of male. There were no female, no juvenile burials in it. So it looks more as if these early Christian sites were exclusively used for the burial of clerics for the first few centuries, and it's only after the 8th century that they encouraged the laity to become involved. This, incidentally, is an extremely important site because it's the only place, I think, in Britain or Ireland where you get early medieval graves surviving above ground undisturbed, because the gable wall of the church fell down on top of them, and you can see that they're very, very finely carved stone crosses at both the head of the graves, the bottom of the graves, and on top of them. But there are no inscriptions, which is interesting. There are no inscriptions on them. In general, in the Ferta, you would have expected them to get buried in the old ring ditches, as they described with the round ones. And you can see that these ring ditches go back to the Bronze Age. You can see that example there for Danesford, where you have a Bronze Age one and an Iron Age one. And they're mostly like the ones in Balnaboy, where you had a series of cremations into them. Now that we can date cremated bones, we're now beginning to get a better understanding of the chronology of these. And they're partial burials. Most of the person is dealt with elsewhere. At Halderstown, we see how this burial tradition continued to the early medieval period, where you have a series of inhumations dating to the 5th century, 6th century placed in there. It was quite interesting that one of these ring ditches was actually redug at about the same time, but it was not used for burial, so they were still maintaining the old pagan burial grounds as well as reusing them. Here's just another example of them again, where you can see quite a lot of 5th, 6th, 7th century burials placed inside an Iron Age ring ditch. In some cases there wasn't a ring ditch. This is a site at Bettystown, County Meath, and it started off as a Bronze Age flat cemetery with some Iron Age 1st, 2nd burials, and then the continuation of these burials in the 5th century, 5th, 6th century AD. Now the thing about these early sites is that in most cases the number of burials present is relatively small. They seem to be family burial grounds rather than community burial grounds. And also in some, although not in all cases, that it continues just for the first few centuries of Christianity. The exceptions there were the ones that I showed you in Louth, which went into the 7th, 8th century. But in the last 10 years, we have come across a totally different type of burial ground. Because the one thing we did understand, or believe, is that burial and settlement were two separate entities, whether you're dealing with pagan or with Christian burials. And this has now really been totally changed around, because we find these sites which produce large numbers of burials, often extending right throughout the early medieval period, some of them going into the later medieval period, and even some up to the 17th century. They continue as burial places. And they are found in the midst of very, very active, long-lived early enclosure settlements. And these settlements, as well as being characterized by the burials, are also characterized by very, very intense industrial workage in the way in the evidence for ironworking, but also for intense agricultural processing. And we find, you can see that there are different types of these sites, and I'll return to them later. In some cases, the burials begin right in the 5th and 6th century, but oddly, in other cases, like this one here at Cameron, County Tipperary, the burials don't begin until the 6th, 7th, and generally don't reach their flowers until the 8th, 9th century. So it's a continuation right through the whole of the early medieval period that you have these new sites with burial and industrial working and habitation going on at the same time. I'll come back to those later briefly, and I will just move then swiftly to ecclesiastical investigations. Well, in general, these big developments tried to avoid ecclesiastical sites, and it was only very occasionally that they were excavated. And in this case here at Clonfad, County Westmeath, we clipped the edges of the two outer vallum ditches of an early medieval site. And it's often been wondered what went on these sites, because in general we've tended to concentrate our excavations in the centre of these monastic sites, as in the case in Iona, for instance, and not go out to the wider areas outside. And we know from that same 8th century collection of rules that these various areas demarcated different areas of sanctity. They said we ought to be 2 or 3 termini around the holy place, the first of which we allow no one into at all except priests, because women do not come near it, or women unless they are clerics. And second, into the streets and crowds of common people who give much to wickedness, we allow to enter. And third, in men who have been guilty of homicide, adulterers and prostitutes, with permission and according to custom, we do not prevent from going within. Now, this is a very schematized type of description of what should go on in these. And what came to our surprise is when the large chunk of the site was uncovered in Clonfad, there was virtually nothing in it at all. With the exception of one small smithing area, the rest of that large area was virtually sterile. And it suggests that these early monasteries went into big expansion when they were laid out, which they never actually fulfilled. In the case here, the vallum was a secondary feature. And that's what we found as well on quite a few other sites, that the vallum is secondary. And it's the same in Iona. The major vallum that was dug next to Religorum at Iona was built essentially at least after the death of Columba. But they were important because they seem to have been deliberately filled in. When you think of the tens of thousands of ring forts that still survive in Ireland with their banks and ditches around them, there are virtually none of the monasteries. All the vallums have been filled in. And it was found at Clonfad that the vallums were dug in the 6th, 7th century and filled in deliberately in the 8th, 9th century. And in the 890s, you get a record of the church at Clonfad being sacked. And it may well be that the vallum, in order to do away with the importance or reduce its importance, was deliberately infilled at this stage. And we get other vallums that are filled in and redug again very shortly, virtually in the same place. So the vallums play a very symbolic part in them, and destroying them seems to be a very conscious act during the early Christian period. Why did I put this here? Right. One of the things that we have made a bit of progress on in the last 10 years is on shrines, graves for saints. And I know they were referred to in some of the Scottish sites here today, and there's the one in Iona, the church shrine, that O'Carrigan argues could be the earliest in the Western Church. And I totally agree with O'Carrigan and with Ewan that Iona is the important monastery for both Ireland and Scotland at the time. You can see that in the 1950s, Church Island and Rask, there were some small stone monuments, kists that were referred to as shrines, but they'd been rifled and generally destroyed. But more recently, we got, with the excavation of Illanloughlin, we got to see actually how sophisticated these shrines were. You can see the island there before it was excavated, and you can just see the top of the pyramid of the 2 slate slabs. And you can see that the shrine is a massive construction built on a plinth with a ceremonial paved walkway up to it. There's another diagram of it. The inside of it remained intact. It consisted of 2 small kists with 2 partial burials inside of it, dated to the 7th, 8th century as far as I can remember. Rather oddly, there was also the skull of a child in one of these. Now, it is thought when it was excavated, I was involved with this on the environmental evidence, so I was down on the excavation. It was thought when we were excavating it that the child burial has something to do with the fact that the island had been used as a children's burial ground in post-medieval times. But in fact, when radiocarbon dated, it turned out to be the same age as the two saints. And underneath this, the whole shrine was dismantled. Underneath it, was found some empty dug graves. And it's argued that they were the original burial place of the people before they were translated, raised up into the shrine, and bits of them dispersed. This is an island for which we have no documentary evidence, so we don't know who we're dealing with. Also at Innilochen, we finally got these famous pre-stone church, wooden churches, and you can see there that it in fact turned out to be made out of sod with two parallel rows of vertical stones holding up the sod. Quite a big church, but immediately under the church, and much more convincing than any of those little diddly churches that were supposed to be represented by the post stones, which are no longer than that table, for instance. This was a real full-sized church. Another thing that we made some breakthrough over the last 10 years, and I mention this because this is Scotland's first, as I know, in Ballasgate Chapel. I took this from the web, this photograph, and there's a poster about it upstairs, are these famous lacks, which we've had in Ireland. And we've never really known what date they were, what they were for, are they post-medieval. Charles Thomas was the only person to actually spend more than a paragraph on them when he wrote about them over a few pages, pointing out that they derived from lek, the early Irish term for a sepulchre or a burial place, or a place of rest, a euphemism. But recently we've managed to at least finally tack them down into the early Christian period. There's been some very interesting excavations going on at Skellig Michael, and you can see here where the lact is. I'll point it out. You can see that the lact is, that's the church there, and that's the later medieval church, and the outdoor lact is outside the churches. And on top of it, they've placed the remains of a cross that they found nearby when they were excavating it. And you can see that when they excavated underneath it, they found a stone kist, which is probably a saint's shrine, like the ones that we just had in Innilochen. Now, it had been rifled, there was no bones left in it, but you can see that the cross was actually, they found the base of the cross, the top of it that's now lying on top of the lock, stuck into the original kist, and then the lock built up against it. And there were burials up against that lock of 10th, 11th century date, so it's definitely of early medieval date. More difficult in other places to show where the lock is associated with burial. This is one of the ones in Religoran, dug by Jerry O'Sullivan, Thomas O'Carrigan. And you can see there that there were two enclosures with locks in them, and when they excavated they found that they were over burials, but are they specifically over burials or not? The big graveyard, hard to say. The small graveyard is a bit more convincing. But you should notice that the radiocarbon dates for the burials underneath are right at the end of the early, they are 10th, 11th century, so they seem to be a late phenomenon within the early Christian period. And there was one other one though, just when you thought we had it sewn up that they have to do with burials, there was another Inishmurray one. Again, you have the lock inside a sort of modern enclosure, and when it was taken down, it was found that there was an early enclosure, but that the lock was built on top of a paved area. And when they dismantled the lock, they found that it lay directly over quite a sophisticated post hole with packing stones right at the middle of it that originally held something wooden. And it's argued that this wooden thing had to be taken out almost simultaneously with the building of the lock, because the lock was set right on top of it. And it's argued that the lock was originally over one of these early types of wooden altars that are thought to have existed at the time. You can see here there are no burials, but it leads out to the remains of a hut. Now this is outside the main monastery at Inishmurray. And we think that this is part of a pilgrimage landscape that's emerging at the end of the early Christian period, because this is the first, it's during this time after 1000 that we get our first real evidence for pilgrimage within Ireland, with people being killed by lightning on Croagh Patrick, for instance, or people being thrown out of Strua wells because of the trouble they were causing at the Holy Well in the 11th century. So we're now getting an early Christian landscape of pilgrimage, and I think that's where the lacks fit into it. Okay, to go back now to settlement in general. 10 years ago, all we had was ring forts. We had 47,000 of them, so we weren't exactly looking for anything else to explain where people were living in the early medieval period. Found virtually all over the country. Generally seen as farmsteads, a house or one or two in the middle. They are referred to in the law tracts as a rath. The rath is the area in the middle, and the liss is the encampment around it, and it's translated as a farmyard or a courtyard, which is interesting because it's not really set. Since then, we have decided we've got a large, and oh yes, one of the things about ring forts that has always been said is we should dig round them, because there you will find the habitations of the lower classes and the poorer classes. But we had a lot of excavations around ring forts, large areas cleared, and there is nothing outside them. And there's no fields, unless usually there are fields in some, but they seem to be added later. Generally, these things stand in splendid isolation in the landscape, and there are none of the things that you would expect with a working farm, the paddocks, the enclosures, and things like that. They've just been missing. And the dates for them, you can see there, they seem to be going out of fashion into decline after 700. However, now we've discovered these new sites, and they are, as I say, full of evidence for metalworking and for farm processing. I won't show you a slide of iron slag, but I'll show you ones of Quadrant Killings. There were perhaps 6 of these known from the early medieval period 10 years ago. We're now up to over 800, most of which are from the early medieval period. And they are all found. Very few of them are found in ring forts. The ones that are on later stages of ring forts, after the ring forts have gone out of use. They seem to be after the ditches have filled in. Okay, so most of them are found on these new big complex sites that we know nothing about. And they can basically divide it into 3 types. There's the first that start off with ring forts, settled over several hundred years, and you have field and paddocks, and some of them seem to be bits of farmyards. In the case here, you can see the kiln at the bottom with its own little enclosure, and then a bigger enclosure next to it, which might be the haggard or the stackyard where you would keep your crops. These are beginning to look like farmyards, opposed to what we were looking at beforehand. This one here hasn't been killed trough, hasn't yet been, we don't have the dates for it. None of these sites have been published in complete lists. Well, 1 or 2 have, but there have been short articles in most of them. This case here was published, started off as a ring fort, but we don't have any of the radiocarbon dates. But you can see the complexity of these sites continuing on for a long period of time. Here's Barnestown. Starts off with a very odd ring fort, because it's the only ring fort that we know that doesn't have an entrance. All ring forts have a bit of the ditch left uncut. This one must have had a drawbridge. But anyway, occupied over several centuries. The usual evidence for your corn drying kilns. Again, you can see, I just pointed this one out, a little one. There's several on the site. One at the top there, and it's the enclosure, one at the bottom enclosure. This is waterlogged, so we've got a lot of evidence for woodworking as well as metalworking on the site. And then a rather simplistic one at the other end. This may have started out as a ring fort. We're having difficulty now knowing if it's round, is it a ring fort or not. And you can see this has got enclosures, it's got its kilns, it's got its ironworking area, and the first time we're finding these 4-poster and 9-poster features, which are interpreted in Iron Age Britain and Europe as the foundations for granaries, raising them off the grade. So you can see there's a lot from the very sophisticated to the relatively simple. And the same occurs with these settlement cemeteries. A few dozens of these now. You have the burials in them, continuing for a large period of time, continuing much later than the ones that we're getting in Ferta, as I said earlier on. And again, lots of enclosures, gardens present in this site, and this site here you're also getting a figure of a 9-poster showing that it is a farming entity. And these can get really, really complicated. This is Ninch, which has, it's just been a short article, there's no dates published for it. But as you can see, it has 8 phases, and when I start reading it, says that phase 1 has 5 sub-phases. So whether we'll ever see the light of day or not. But we should note that the cemetery, which is you can see up here, only comes into existence at phase 7, so quite a bit into it. So you have this continuation of burial right through the series. And then, again, other ones like this. Other ones, yes, there are other ones then that are neither start up as ring forts or are settled in cemeteries. The third ones are ones that are just complex sites on their own. Don't seem to evolve from ring forts, but are contemporary with them and don't have the burials on them. They can be simple, like Killikawini that you have here, or else they can be hugely complex, like Rosetown, which continues in use over several cemeteries, several centuries. And finally, you get some sites that look like ring forts, but they're not ring forts. At least we feel when we see these that we have some idea of what they might be. And that case at Low Park, with its souterrains and ironworking ages, it looks like a bi-ballot ring fort, except you have palisades around it rather than the banks and ditches. And then you have sites that look like ring forts, but they're the wrong shape, like Newton, which is which people have christened, which is a terrible term, the plectrum-shaped monuments, but I think it's going to stick. And may the person spend a long time in purgatory who first came up with it. And you can see the bottom one is also an odd shape, but it is, all the stuff from it is as you get in a ring fort, except it has Bronze Age and early Iron Age material in it. 10 years ago, we knew nothing about this. Nothing at all about this. We hadn't the slight inclination that these were going to come up. So where does this leave us in terms of the ring fort? Well, the honest answer should be, I should say, I haven't a clue. But having looked at them, if you go back and look at ring forts, they're mentioned in the law tracts. And it is the obligation of a client in order to dig the list of the noble. Okay? The implication is that ring forts only belonged to the noble classes or royal classes. You had to have clients, which is the equivalent of vassals, okay, in order to do this. Now, this has been rejected by archaeologists because we've always thought there's far too many of them for just to be all noble classes. Also, lots of them don't show any objects, and produce no objects of high status that would support the fact that they're noble classes. And most importantly, where would everybody else have lived if they're not in ring forts? Well, now we have the answer to that, so we have to go back to the ring forts. Now, one of the things that all these sites have in common, the non-ring fort ones, is interestingly, there are occasional, what you would call high-status objects found on them, like that nice colonial brooch from Barnstown, and even a bit of gold filigree from Low Park. But finds are not really a good indication of status, because they can be gifted, stolen, lost, as it were. They're not proof that the site that they're found is high status. So what really provides evidence for high status is patronage of the arts, patronage of fine art making, fine metalworking. And that's the crucibles, the molds. And these are found in lots of ring forts, panels, and found all over ecclesiastical sites, coming back to which Martin Carver was arguing this morning. These were centres. But with one exception, none of these sites, dozens and dozens and dozens of them, have turned up any evidence for this. There was one evidence for a very short period of time at Rosetown. I even have the articles here, where you had a crucible and some trial pieces. But these do not exist on other sites, which suggests to me that the ring forts, or the good ring forts, I think there are two types of ring forts. There are ring forts which are real ring forts of nobles, and then there are imitation ring forts, which the upper free farmers dig themselves to keep up with the neighbours. You know what I mean? But I think that a large majority of the free farmers were living on these type of sites now. They look complex because they've just been changed. They have been occupied over long periods of time. It's quite possible that they weren't isolated, that you've got communities of people surviving here, because the law tracts do, for instance, state that some of the lower grades of farmers had to share their killings, their mills, had to share their ploughshares. So I think now that we now can stop thinking of in terms of ring forts, and we have to see this whole different other strata of settlement in Ireland at the time. And to finish up, if you want to get a more balanced idea of what's going on in Scotland, start building motorways. Thank you.